Hey folks, welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio, where we talk exclusively about the Beatles here. I'm Ken Michaels, and with me this time is Kris Engelhardt. And that's a name that I hope you're familiar with because he's put out a series of books through the years that deal with what I call side projects of the Beatles, meaning songs that the Beatles either wrote or co-wrote for another artist, songs that they either produced or even co-produced for another artist, or songs that they played on for another artist. And it's a whole other world out there. There's more to the Beatles than their group and solo recordings, although that alone, that's all I had in my collection. That'd be enough to satisfy me for the rest of my life. But there's so much more to explore. And Kris has put out, it's now his third book, which we'll talk about in just a moment. The first was called Beatles Undercover, the second called Deeper Undercover, and now his new one, which encompasses all three books, is called Beatles Fully Uncovered, right there. Kris Engelhardt, welcome to the channel.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, before we talk to you about this whole idea of side projects, I just want to let my listeners know that one of the first Beatle books I ever bought, certainly the most worn out book I've ever gotten on the Beatles, is, well, I made it worn out. It's all together now, which was a discography written by Harry Castleman and Walter Podrazik, and it covered the years 1961 through 1975. It was a discography that covered really everything. The Beatles recordings, what was released, solo recordings, what was released, BBC recordings, the original versions of songs the Beatles and solo Beatles covered, Apple recordings, and they also had sections in the book, songs for others. It would be the Beatles for others, John Lennon for others. And it was there that I learned about a lot of recordings that, like I said, they either wrote, produced, or played on for other people. And in those days, when I was trying to find out this information, we didn't have any internet. And so I had to rely on Beatle fanzines like Beatle Fan and Good Day Sunshine and Beatles Monthly. And I'd be thrilled to learn about any of these recordings. 4th of July by John Christie drove me crazy. It was a song that Paul McCartney wrote for this artist, and we could talk about that song if you like, Kris.
Yes.
It was a hard record to find. Nowadays, so many of these recordings, you can just go on YouTube and find out what they were like. Listen to the recordings yourself. But I love this particular aspect of the Beatles' careers. And in my radio show that I've been doing for 40 years now, I always slip in these side projects. I do it in my syndicated show. Some of the songs that we're going to talk about in this interview will be songs like those that I just put in the last few years. But what I want to start off this conversation with, Kris, is to ask you what led you down this path to really take this particular approach, this side of the Beatles' history.
The exact same authors in the exact same book. That was my inspiration. It was all together now. I thought, when the Beatles broke up, on the one hand, we'd lost the Beatles. Maybe you got 2 albums a year and a couple of singles. But when the Beatles broke up, and also when they formed Apple Records, this really sort of broadened their horizon. We suddenly had maybe 1 or 2 solo albums a year from each of the 4 Beatles. And we also had their projects that they were put in charge of at Apple, such as McCartney or Harrison with Badfinger, or George with Jackie Lomax or Doris Troy, and Paul with Mortimer, and a little bit with James Taylor. So they all had their projects. And also when the Beatles broke up and they did their solo albums, they would bring in other musicians to play on their recordings, whether it was Nicky Hopkins or whether it was Jim Keltner or whether it was Leon Russell. And so as a result, the Beatles often would contribute to their albums, these other musicians who contributed. So they would contribute to each other's recordings. And I was fascinated by that because I think initially some of George Harrison's best slide solo guitar work was on other people's recordings. And I thought, my gosh, why is he not playing his guitar that well on his own recordings? Why is he saving it for? But I think it gave him a platform to kind of let loose and experiment a little more and feel a little freer, because in many cases they had to do these contributions under pseudonyms for contractual reasons. So you weren't always really sure who was playing on what, but boy, when you heard some of George's early slide work on like a Nicky Hopkins album, or even with Eric Clapton, it was amazing. So that captured me very much the same way I think it captured you.
Yeah. And so much, you were pointing out George Harrison, there's so much great material that they wrote for other people or participated on. Through the years, everybody points out the McGear album,
Mm-hmm.
like a Lost Wings album in a way, much
Yeah.
the same way that Splinter's first album is.
Yeah, George Harrison album.
It's got George's fingerprints all over it.
All over it.
It sounds just like a Harrison album. But so you did 2 books and now you're doing the 3rd one. So talk about from the point of the last book up till today, what that covers. And then, like I said, you do combine the first 2 books and update those first 2 books for the new.
Right. If you have this 3rd new edition, you basically have everything that was in the first 2 editions updated to 2022, and then you have an additional about 90 new artists that have been added to this book for a grand total of about 375 separate chapters or artists / groups / individual musicians. So this book has essentially 90 new artists, and the other remaining artists of the 375 are all updated chapters, not only in the bio, but in the data as well.
Right.
So like Bob Dylan or Eric Clapton or artists that have been in the first 2 books obviously have worked, in this case, McCartney with Eric Clapton. So that's noted, that data is included. Bob Dylan has recently released many of his archival material that included George Harrison's contributions and Ringo's contributions. So those chapters are also fully updated.
Right. And I think people who follow my podcast shows for Things We Said Today and Talk More Talk, where I have a newscast in every single show, and I'll also mix in news on this channel, they know when there's new side projects as I learn them, and in the last year or so, I a few times referred to Ringo as one-track Ringo. Playing on one track on Colin Hayes' new album. He's playing on one track on Edgar Winter's new album, and Steve Lukather's new album.
Yep. And he, a few years back, Gary Burr as well, 2 songs that Gary's recently released that Ringo drums on, and Rodney Crowell, which is a great track. You're only happy when you're miserable. Ringo drums on that as well. And there's another track that Ringo drums on from those sessions that remains unreleased. So hopefully that track will see the light of day before too long.
Okay, well, let's discuss, we're going to pinpoint some of what you feel have been really interesting side projects from various Beatles here. The first one we're going to talk about is Glenn Aitken. Can you talk about who this artist is? Because I know I put this in my show, my radio show, Every Little Thing, and I like the track a lot.
This is a great, you talk about accidents will happen. This individual, Glenn, was originally, I believe, from New Zealand or Australia. I think he was originally from New Zealand, then he immigrated to Australia, and then he went on to resorts in the Maldives Islands. He was one of the guest service people and entertainers that was hired on at a Hilton hotel in the Maldives. And one evening he's playing his guitar out on the beach to diners, and sitting in the front row is Paul McCartney with his then wife Heather. And Paul complimented him on his music. And the next day, Paul was interested in going out scuba diving. And so he went to the guest services area, and Glenn was working there. And Glenn said, well, I'm the guy that can help you with that, because Paul wanted to videotape it. So he said, yeah, I've got video cameras and we can go out and I'll video you diving, which they did. And then they came back, and he and Paul decided that they would come up with some music, whatever they had with them. I don't know, musically, guitars or keyboards or something, you know, portable, and added the music to this DVD, which is in Paul's private collection, remains unreleased. But Glenn was telling me that it was credited as a Aiken McCartney composition for the music that they ended up using for the background for the DVD, for the video. And then McCartney was so intrigued by one of Glenn's songs that he included it on his Glastonbury Groove album of some of his favorite tracks, and invited Glenn to sign with MPL. So Glenn signed with MPL, and then he released his first album. And on the day of Paul's divorce, Paul actually showed up. They didn't expect him to show up at the studio, but he showed up at the studio and laid down some bass work on one of Glenn's tracks and helped him arrange another track. So
what was the name of that song? Do you remember?
It is Something New and Ordinary People. Ordinary People is the one that he plays bass on.
Yeah, that's the one that I put in my radio show.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was really interesting. And to me, I mean, this is just my ears. It has like a Pet Shop Boys feel to it. I don't know if you think the same way, but that's what I had heard. But I found it really interesting.
Yeah, these are the kind of serendipitous stories that I just think are amazing, you know. What are the odds?
It's almost like was it Carlos Mendez?
Yes.
In Portugal that Paul spotted playing in a band, and then he ended up writing the song Penina for him.
Well, actually, there's a lot of confusion regarding that, and I finally was able to get to the bottom of that story. Jada Hari was actually the band. Most people think it was a Dutch band. It was not. It was a Portuguese band, and they were the entertainment or the house band at a hotel called Penina that McCartney was staying at in, I believe, Albufeira, Portugal, on the Algarve. And Paul was the worse for wear that evening, having had quite a bit to drink by his own admission. And he got up, as McCartney is wont to do, thrashing around on the drums and the piano, and just late night, you know, after pretty much everyone had probably gone to bed. And Paul's just fooling around with this band, and he wrote this little song and told them they could have it. And they went out and recorded it, and nothing ever really happened to it. And then Carlos Menendez, who was a fairly popular singer in Portugal, heard the song, and he covered it and recorded it. Needless to say, McCartney's publishing company wasn't terribly happy about the fact that he was just handing out songs one night to this local band who went and recorded it, and then another EMI artist, which was Carlos Menendez, also recorded it. The song never really charted or had any legs to it, but McCartney did do a brief rendition of it during the Get Back rehearsals at Twickenham. So we did get to hear him fiddle on the piano on that song a little bit. I seriously doubt it'll ever be released by McCartney, but who knows?
Yeah, just goes to show if you're in McCartney's orbit, depending upon his mood, he can write a song for you.
Yeah, anything's possible. It's amazing.
All right. Tell me about, well, a lot of people watching this will know about this recording, but the Bloody Beetroots, which is really interesting to me, that recording.
Yeah, well, what happened was that was a song that Paul had from
Electric Arguments.
Yeah, exactly. And so this guy from the Bloody Beetroots, whose name is Sir Bob Cornelius Rifo, I guess his real name is Simone Coogan. He's Italian, and he was being produced by Youth. who also worked with McCartney on his Fireman and Electronic Arguments and his McCartney's electronic music albums.
Mhm.
And through the connection between Youth and McCartney and Youth and Bloody Beetroots, they basically re-recorded one of the songs called Out of Sight.
Nothing too much, just out of sight.
Yeah, nothing too much. Yeah, exactly. So that's how that all came about. And he got to go to Paul's studio and meet him. And he just sort of described to me how he deconstructed the song and basically tore it apart and tried to reinvent it. And I don't think initially McCartney was real happy with what he had done because he didn't hear back from Paul for quite some time. And he was hoping that Paul would contribute to what he had done. And eventually McCartney invited him to his home studio at the mill. And they ended up getting on and hitting it off and creating what is the finished product. And there's numerous alternate mixes of that song that have been released. So there's not just Out of Sight, there's Out of Sight remixed times 12 or something. There's quite a number of remixes, but
And you know, this is becoming a more common thing where an artist just gives his tracks to somebody and they remix it and instrumentation or whatever they want to. And that's what McCartney 3 imagined was.
right, exactly.
In some ways, a song can have a new life when you take, you know, the original recordings, hand it over to another artist and see what they do with it. So, you know, I think it's really interesting. Some refer to it as EDM, this version of Out of Sight, but I like it a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you know, I could listen to Tom Petty all day long, but I'm not sure I have the appetite to listen to some of the electronic music for any great length of time, but that probably dates myself. So
Gary Burr. Gary Burr is before we talk about him, I'm very impressed with him. I've had the chance to interview him before. He has a long history as a successful songwriter in the country.
correct.
And you know, to some people who follow everything that the Beatles have done solo-wise, and they know he was in Ringo's Roundheads, he's had some history, you know. He wrote Love's Been a Little Bit Hard on Me for Juice Newton. He wrote one of Clay Aiken's hits. But there's a lot of songs in the country feel that he had a hand in writing.
Absolutely.
He is such a great addition, was a great addition to the Roundheads, and still, you know, on the post Mark Hudson period, he still co-writes a song here and there with Ringo. But
yeah, if you go down the list of Ringo's albums of the last 15 years, there are a number of them where Gary wrote probably half the songs on the album or co-wrote them with Ringo. So he was a major contributor as a songwriter to a good many of Ringo's recordings, and a wonderful guy, very, very easy to interview, very forthcoming as far as information, very helpful. I can see why Ringo likes to collaborate with him. He just seems to be easy to work with.
yeah, yeah. And he lives not too far from me.
Oh, where are you, by the way?
I live in Connecticut.
Okay. Well, that's where he's originally from, I believe, but I think he's down in the Nashville area now.
But every now and then he comes back to this area. He's out of Meriden, Connecticut. So
right. Yeah, I knew he was from Connecticut.
yeah, it's like a half hour away from me.
Yeah.
But so what songs did Ringo work on with Gary for Gary's album?
Well, he did one called when Ringo joined the band, which is basically Gary writing a song describing what it was like being in Ringo's band, essentially. And then there was another song called Shout a Little Louder that Gary just released. I think it actually predates the When Ringo Joined the Band song, but it was released after. I just released, I think, within the last 6 months. So that's out there as well. So there's two songs that Ringo drums on Gary's two different albums. One is called Middleman Burr. Georgia Middleman is his wife, and she's also a fairly successful songwriter. And she's also contributed to some of Ringo's recordings. And then the other album was, what was Shout a Little Louder on Shout. The album's called Shout.
Okay.
And they're both available, I think, directly from Gary. So if you go to his website, folks can pick up both of those albums. And they're both very, very good albums, by the way. Very solid songwriting throughout.
Mm-hmm.
Plug for Gary.
Yeah, incidentally, if any of these songs are on YouTube that we're discussing, I'm going to try to post the links in the description box so you can hear what we're discussing, then go right to the songs if you want to. All right. You mentioned one from Rodney Crowell that Ringo's on. What was it called again?
You're only happy when you're miserable. And it's typical Rodney Crowell lyrics. I mean, you know, it's tongue in cheek. It's a great song. And that album, that whole album is really, really good. I think it's called Texas, or I'd have to check. I forget the name of the album, but it's a very, very good album. And he connected with Ringo through Brett Carpenter. They knew each other. Mm-hmm. Separately, and Brett, apparently, according to Rodney, is one of those kind of guys that likes to make connections. So apparently Brett has been responsible for Ringo getting together with a number of different artists. I think Ray Wiley Hubbard is another one who I think Brett kind of was the mediator between the catalyst between Ringo and Ray. So and that's
surprise too. The Ray
covered.
They did a cover of Coochie Coochie, Ringo's.
Yeah, and both of Ray's last two albums are just wonderful. Great albums. So if folks want to check out his albums, they're very, very good.
Yeah, he was what you would call like an Americana.
Yeah. Good songwriter.
Yeah, and I always like when Ringo does anything in the country vein, or in this case, works with country artists, like a Rodney Crowell. So we should do more with those.
You know, I had suggested once to David Fishoff years ago that Ringo should consider doing a country all-star band.
I've thought the same thing, you know, but probably, you know, the legendary country artists. So, I mean, he's friends with Willie Nelson.
Yeah.
And Willie is still out there. He's 89 and he's still touring.
Yeah.
But, you know, who knows? You know, so many people would consider it an honor to be in a band with Ringo. So if you get any of the legends that are still around, that have been around since, I don't know, 60s and 70s and 80s, yeah, I would definitely go for that. I wonder if did Fishoff ever ask Ringo?
I have no idea whether they ever discussed it or not. No idea at all. But I did send David for years early on lists of potential all-star band members, and quite a number of them showed up. So I don't know how big of a hand I had in the selection list, but I certainly I had about a 2-page list of names that I sent to David back in the mid 90s, late 90s. So, you know, I think any of these guys would make great potential all-star band members.
You know, the same thing happened to me, because in one of the podcast shows that I did many years ago, I remember that I had sent a suggestion to, if it wasn't Fishoff, it was Ringo's publicist, that Roger Hodgson should be in the band. And it might be interesting to have Howard Jones. I think I might have said Sheila E. too.
Mm-hmm.
Lo and behold, look what happened.
Yeah.
I know I put Ann Wilson in there too. I think, oh God, you know, she's a big Beatle fan. She would love to be in a band with Ringo. But you never know. You make these suggestions and it could happen.
Yeah.
All right. So you have an artist listed as Fire, and I'm not sure what that is.
Yeah, Fire, that's one of those things. This was a band that was signed to Apple Publishing. And they did a song, and Paul McCartney had heard it on the radio and didn't like it, and called up the folks at Apple Publishing and said, you should take that band and get them back in the studio and have them re-record that song. And then McCartney proceeded to sort of give a list to people at Apple Publishing as to exactly what needed to be done with the song.
Hmm.
So as a result, I considered that for the most part, McCartney production contribution,
Uh-huh.
because he had such, he said, double up the guitar, double up the vocals, give it more punch, do this, do that. And so these guys went back in the studio and recut the song to McCartney's specifications.
Okay. So this, what was the name of the song?
The name of the song has something about father is to the son. I would have to look this one up real quickly.
Hmm.
There's only 2,000 songs in this book.
Not all in your head?
No, they are not all in my head,
Quite a
unfortunately.
lot there to absorb, so.
It is a lot to absorb. It's a lot to keep track of. And fire, let's see where fire is real quickly. The song was called Father's Name is Dad. And there are two versions of it. And the original version, of course, is very rare because it was withdrawn. And the second version was the one that was released, but it's also fairly obscure. And then recently it was released on one of those cherry red compilation CDs. So both versions, I believe, are on that CD. And the story is told in the liner notes about how, they re-recorded the song, and McCartney had called into Apple Publishing and said, you need to do this, you need to do that. The song has potential, but it hasn't been properly produced. So
Okay.
I felt there was enough. The fact that the band would actually go back in the studio and record it, re-record it, I thought was pretty interesting.
Well, hey, if you've got Paul's suggestions, yes, you're gonna go into the studio.
Yeah. So
Quite an honor that he even takes an interest in the song. But what year did that second version, the one that
I'm guessing it's early 68, around the grapefruit period, when Apple still didn't have a label, because the recording came out on Decca.
Okay.
So it would have been sometime, I believe, in early 68.
Yeah. God bless Cherry Red Records. I got to get more into their releases.
They're pretty interesting.
Yeah, they're about to put out a 4 CD George Martin collection of what he did before the Beatles.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting.
Coming out, I think it's in November. Yeah.
Well, I'll definitely have to look for that.
All right. Also, I know of this one, Charlotte Gainsbourg.
Mm-hmm.
When I heard this song called Songbird in a Cage, it sounded a lot like Linda vocally to me.
Really? That's interesting. I've heard the song, and I don't think it's one of McCartney's better compositions, but apparently they did quite a bit of surgery on that song, and really, again, kind of like the Bloody Beetroots, really tore it apart and then sort of reassembled it. But the interesting part of that story is how they coaxed Paul into coming to Electric Ladyland in New York and adding to the recording, which he did. But Charlotte had explained how the best part of that experience was watching McCartney just toy with all these different instruments in the studio, trying to come up with different sounds, which sounds like Paul, but apparently they just got such a kick out of him being so experimental with all these different instruments and trying to come up with different sounds. That was really, to me, the interesting part of the story.
Okay. Well, when I hear it, I kind of think of like one of Linda's like talk through songs, like Orion. It has that kind of vibe for me. But
like the white coated man kind of.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. Graham Gouldman, remind me here. There's a song that he recently released where he was talking about joining Ringo's band, I think it was.
Yeah, it's kind of like the other side of the Gary Burr song. That's very similar in subject matter and in sentiment, because they were both basically trying to give thanks to Ringo. in the song and express, you know, their gratitude for being in the All-Starr Band. And Graham, I got to interview him extensively, and lovely guy, and he just had a wonderful time as a member of the All-Starr Band, and said he would be glad to drop whatever he was doing and go back and join the band again. He had a wonderful time, and told me some interesting stories about Paul that didn't really have anything to do, you know, had to do with the period of the McGear album that you mentioned earlier, because that was recorded at their Strawberry at 10cc's Strawberry Studios. So Graham got to know Paul a little bit through those sessions. And then, of course, Eric Stewart as well, also a member of 10cc, who's featured in my book. Also got to get to know Paul through those sessions, and then went on to work with Paul on Press to Play and a few other albums. So
I've often said Press to Play is, I rate it very highly in the.
Yeah, it's one of the more underrated McCartney albums for sure.
Thank you for saying that. You and I are going to get along just fine. Anyway, Steve Lukather. Oh, by the way, what's the name of the Graham Goldman song?
Oh, gee, hold on here. It is Standing Next to Me.
Okay. All right. I'm pretty sure, like I said, I'm going to put links to these songs in the description box. Steve Lukather, I know, just had a solo album. And I know he drummed on one of the songs.
Yep.
I think it was
Run to Me, I think is the name of it. Going from memory. Great song. It's kind of definitely a 60s vibe to it, with kind of a Beach Boys meet Beatles sound to it that I like. And it's written by two members of Toto, Steve and Joseph Williams, and Ringo drums on that. And great video for that song too. That one should be somewhere on YouTube. So I'm sure I just really, really like that song. I'm surprised it didn't do better, but Ringo apparently really liked it too, because Ringo and Steve have started to write a few things together and do something.
I love Steve's work with Ringo. I'm so happy with them connected, and you know, he's 10 years in the All-Stars now.
Yeah, at least now. And who are you going to get that's a better guitar player than Steve Lukather? My God, you know, that's an A-lister right there. So Ringo's got one of the best guitarists in the world in his band, and he's wise to keep him.
Yeah, I mean, so much I love about him. I love the songs that he's written with Ringo, and when he does his lead guitar work on stage, everything just sounds so right for the song, and you could put him in any situation and he's going to play well. He's one of the all-time greatest guitar players. Steve Lukather, definitely. I hope that there's a lot more that he does.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't know, you know, that he worked with McCartney on the Broad Street project.
Yep.
He got to meet and hang and play with George Harrison with a little help from my friends on the Jeff Beccaro tribute concert after Jeff died. So Steve has the you know, he's in a rare club of having worked with 3 of the 4 Beatles.
Right. I interviewed Steve many years ago, and this was long before he started working with Ringo. So we did talk about Broad Street and that experience, but he really got to work with Paul through
Michael Jackson.
Yeah, on Thriller.
Yeah.
That's where that all started.
Yeah, he's a wild and crazy guy, 100 miles an hour with the brakes on, but
It's a good way to describe him. I'd love to interview him again.
Yeah.
Gotta talk about this song. This is a treasure to me. A lot of people would be shocked to know that Paul did a song with Steve Martin.
Yeah. And there's a great story in the book. I got to interview the producer of this song, and it was recorded in a tiny little studio out on Long Island. At least Paul's vocals were. And Paul showed up in shorts and flip-flops, and it was a rather warm day. And stories, I won't give too much away because I want people to buy the book, but stories about Paul doing Elvis impersonations and I guess he was in a pretty playful mood, and they had an awful lot of fun kidding Steve Martin about how he couldn't sing, and so that's one of my favorite stories in the book. And then to hear Steve Martin tell the story on David Letterman, which I believe is out there on YouTube, is just a really, really funny story all the way around, and how they, suggested to Steve that he consider Paul McCartney. And Steve said, well, Paul McCartney, there's no way. And they said, well, wait a minute, you're Steve Martin. You're as big a star as Paul McCartney. You should have every right to ask him. So he, through Lorne Michaels from SNL, went ahead and they contacted Paul. And Paul said, sure, what would you like me to do? Bass or background vocals? And Steve said, no, we want you to sing the song because I can't sing. So that was kind of the running joke at the sessions, that when Paul showed up to lay down his lead vocals on the backing track.
Right.
It's a fun story.
It's a good song, and I'm sure everybody must be aware that Steve Martin is a tremendous banjo player. It used to be if you were brought up on him doing his comedy on stage, you saw him play the banjo a little bit. It wasn't just a prop. He was always a really good.
Oh yeah. Talk about multi-talented. My God, whether it's blowing balloons, comedy, acting, singing and playing, he's an amazing talent. Amazing talent.
He's a Renaissance man.
He is. He absolutely is. Good way to put it.
Yes, but still love the old comedy that he used to do. There's other generations that follow that know him through his movies that don't know all the sketch comedy he was doing and stand-up comedy, and that's a shame.
Back and watch some of the reruns of the Smothers Brothers comedy album, and a good portion of the comedy from those shows was written by Steve Martin.
Right. No, he's got a long history. Brilliant man. And the song, by the way, we sometimes neglect to say the names of the songs, but it's called Best Love.
Yeah. And it has a connection to birds. I don't know if you knew that, but it has a connection to birds. Yeah. When you read the chapter, you'll understand. But Steve wrote the lyrics about an article he'd read about birds. So that's what inspired the song. Okay. And much of the album, in fact, if you look at the album cover, there's birds on the album cover.
I've seen that, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Chris Mullen. Don't know anything about this recording.
This is a great story. There's several examples in the book, 3 that come to mind, of 3 artists in the book. One's name is Natalie McCool, another's name is Liam Lynch, and the other one is Chris Mullen. They were all students at LIPA, at Liverpool Institute for Performing Arts, that McCartney was a co-founder of. And every year or so, McCartney would show up there and he would have one-on-one sessions, writing sessions with students. And Chris Mullen was one of them. And the story is fascinating because he goes into great detail about Paul showing him how he and John would write songs. And while I've heard Paul allude to this in the past, I've never heard it described in quite this way. But Paul told him that they would, when they were writing a song, they would say, now let's take it on a journey. Let's take it somewhere else. Let's take it on a vacation, and take the middle 8 and go in a completely different direction than what would have been intuitive in the first place. And just take it somewhere odd or different and then bring it back home.
Right.
And so this was the way he described his writing process with John. And so he and Chris developed this song called Myself Fooling Me that they wrote together. McCartney said, you don't need to credit me, but you can have, this is how I think the song should be structured. And I think it sounds better this way. And Chris agreed. And so Chris rewrote that song and recorded it. And McCartney never was given credit or took credit, but in fact, McCartney did write a good portion of the middle eight of that song that Kris used. So, and similar stories with a song called America by Natalie McCool, a British Liverpool artist who is also featured in the book, has a chapter in the book. And then Liam Lynch, who worked with McCartney and also worked with Ringo.
Right.
So, interesting stories there.
Huh. So those two artists that you mentioned, Chris Mullen and the woman,
Natalie McCool.
are those available to listen to online? Can you?
As far as I know, they are both available.
Okay.
Natalie's is available on a CD, her CD, and Chris's is downloadable. And I don't know if there is a video of it or anything on YouTube, but both of those songs are available. So yeah, they're out there.
And you said Natalie's song, Paul
I think
did,
it's called America.
yeah, and Paul did write part of it, or
Yes, he wrote a portion of that as well. Similar story to what happened, what I explained with Chris Mullen.
interesting. No, I know that it's once you learn more and more about how the Beatles operated, you know, they never wanted to, they didn't like formula. They didn't stay the same way for too long. And certainly in the songwriting aspect, you could never say you knew where a McCartney song would go or a Lennon song would go. Nothing was ever really, you know, predictable.
No, break the rules.
Yeah. So that's interesting what
Yeah.
what Paul said to Kris. Just a few more we'll mention here. I want to get a few, even though, you know, obviously this you're doing recent stuff here, but maybe a John story or a George story in there as well. But Martin O'Donnell, I don't know about this recording.
Well, Martin O'Donnell and Michael Salvatore were two guys that worked for Bungie, the video game company.
Uh-huh.
And McCartney was tapped to do some of the music for the video game Destiny.
Right. Yeah.
And the story about how that all evolved is fascinating, to say the least.
Mm.
And Martin, God bless him and Michael, because they were both so giving and so cooperative and so insightful and so revealing about how they were able to build trust with McCartney. Because McCartney had come off that, I believe it was the Ocean Kingdom project.
Uh-huh.
And apparently there wasn't a real pleasant experience for him. At least that's what he conveyed to Martin O'Donnell. And so Martin sensed rightfully that he needed to proceed with a degree of caution in order to build up Paul's trust to get him to work with them,
Mhm.
which he quite successfully did. And then the whole project pretty much got shanghaied by Bungie at the end, and much of the music wasn't used of Paul's and was only released some years later and rather surreptitiously sort of leaked for download, and then was available on vinyl, on a 6 vinyl set of Music of the Spheres, it was called.
Yeah.
And McCartney was, according to Marty, was just the most wonderful host, so giving. Gave him a tour of Abbey Road, at the studios, and invited him to several rehearsals out in LA. I think before the one of the Grammy events that Paul performed at, and invited him to several of his performances in Seattle and in Chicago, and one of his recording sessions in New York. So it was, they really built quite a relationship over time, over the period of about 2.5 years. And it's a fascinating story about, you know, how they got into each other's heads and how they gained each other's trust, only to have both of them have the rug pulled out from under them at the end. So it's an interesting story, and one that, as far as I know, has never been told, to at least not in this length and detail before. So it's one chapter I'm very proud of.
Very interesting. I was familiar with the music. I didn't link the name
Mm-hmm.
Martin O'Donnell in there. Why don't we, even though we're talking about earlier years, can you mention, in your opinion, where John's concerned, a couple of side projects that you thought were the most interesting?
Well, here's the problem with John. Unfortunately, he was taken from us far too soon, and so he doesn't have the additional 40 years of music that he might have contributed to for other artists that George and Paul and Ringo had. And John, I don't feel was maybe as confident of a musician. You know, he was a rhythm guitar player and a greatly underrated rhythm guitar player. But I don't feel that John maybe felt he had the confidence to go in and rip off a guitar solo or lay down an amazing bit of piano. He would tend to do some rhythm guitar work. He would tend to do some backing vocals. He would tend to produce. And I think he was comfortable doing that. But he would tend to do that for friends like Elton John or David Bowie. But most of John's extracurricular work, his contributions and collaborations were with Yoko. So when it came time for John to play guitar on someone else's recordings or sing on them or help write them or produce them, 9 out of 10 times it was for Yoko. You know, there was the David Peel project that he produced and produced the album for Elephant's Memory. But beyond that, John really, I mean, he gave some of his early compositions away, like Bad to Me for Billy J. Kramer and a few other songs. But I think John considered himself as much artist and songwriter, maybe more so than an accomplished musician. So I'm not sure John had the desire to play on other people's recordings as much as, say, Paul would or George would, or Ringo for that matter. So because we lost John early on, and because I don't think he had as much interest or confidence, and I think because he was so busy with Yoko's projects, that he really didn't have the opportunity to contribute to that many other artists' recordings.
Yeah, and we'll never know had he lived if he would have entertained that thought more often.
Yeah, or who he would have worked with over the coming years. It's hard to say, you know.
Yeah. George. Now, when it comes to George, I mean, I'm not the only one that said this. Even if you go up to 1975, it's amazing. In some ways, he was more involved, I think, when it came to Apple recording artists than the other Beatles were.
Absolutely.
You know, you talked about Jackie Lomax and Badfinger, and you had Billy Preston in there, and
Doris Troy.
You know, and there we're just talking about the first half of the 70s. You know, he did like to help other artists out and friends of his. So
yeah, Splinter and on down the line, lots of people, Nicky Hopkins and Cheech and Chong. People always get a kick out of that. People are always amazed. My God. And there's a great story. There's another new chapter in the book by a sort of fictitious group called the Raw Nuts, which was actually Al Cooper and his girlfriend at the time, Patty Hyde. And she ended up being married to Cheech Marin. And she was friends with Harrison over the years, particularly because when George learned that she was married to Cheech, he explained to her that he had actually played on Basketball Jones. And she got a kick out of that because that was the voice that Cheech used in that song was the same voice that he used to propose to Patty. And George thought that was hilarious. And she told some great stories about how George would just show up unannounced with his ukulele at restaurants and serenade her on his ukulele. And he would show up unannounced at Al Cooper's apartment, and they would go out and to music stores after hours and buy guitars. And then, of course, Al was with George when they learned of John Lennon's murder at Friar Park. They were recording Somewhere in England album.
yeah.
And so Ringo was at those sessions, and Al was at those sessions. along with Patty, and they did a song, an old Phil Spector song that George laid down some slide guitar on that still hasn't been released and may see release fairly soon because Al has been threatening or promising to release a lot of his archival material. The song's called He Hit Me. And apparently it was recorded, I think, by the Crystals and produced by Phil Spector. And I think he might have even co-written part of it. And George played slide guitar on it on the following night after John Lennon's murder at Friar Park.
Never even heard about this.
Yeah. So that's in the book. That's all documented. And I got to interview Al and Patty at length about the whole Raw Nuts story and going out to George's the day after, the following morning after John's murder, and recording with George and how they changed the lyrics, that Al suggested that George changed the lyrics to all those years ago, because originally the lyrics were rather negative towards John Lennon. And so they decided that it was a better idea to make the lyrics more of a tribute than a dig at John.
Well, originally the song was written for Ringo.
There's debate on that. And I think one of the reasons Ringo passed in the song was he didn't like the lyrics either. But the song's lyrics were originally a dig at John, according to Al Cooper and Patty. Both told me that separately. Yeah.
I never knew this.
Yeah.
That's really surprising.
And they said, I don't think that's a good idea. You might regret that in the future. And then shortly thereafter, George changed the lyrics. And then shortly after that, John was killed.
Wow. It also surprises me that George could record something so quickly right after John died. Well, so did Paul. I mean, Paul had sessions.
Right.
And he was supposed to have recorded Rain Clouds right after, like the day after John was murdered. So how do you go to the studio and do anything and function? I don't know how you do it, but.
Well, Yoko sort of did that too. I mean, she went out fairly soon after and recorded the Seasons of Glass album and put out Walking on Thin Ice. And so I think for them, it's a way to just take your mind off things. I mean, I know for myself, if there's stress in my life, the one thing I do is I turn to writing, because that's what I do. That's what I enjoy doing. And that's what takes my mind off of things that maybe aren't so pleasant in my life at any particular time. So I sort of buy into that idea that artists do their best work when they're under stress or under some sort of pain or turmoil in their life, and they will turn to what they know or know best or enjoy most, and that's their art.
I know Paul has denied that.
Yeah, well, look at what I think was one of Paul's best albums, which is Chaos. And when that came out, and clearly, his marriage was going through some real difficulty, and he happened to pull off what I think is still one of his finest albums. And there is a lot of pain and angst in that album, which is one of the reasons a lot of people don't like that album. It's one of the reasons why I happen to think it's one of his best, songwriting wise.
Kind of a dark album.
It is a dark album.
And for a lot of people, they're not used to that.
No.
All this Mr. Optimistic thumbs up.
Yep, Mr. Wings.
But I say this so many times, some of the best known songs from Paul are sad songs.
Yeah.
Eleanor Rigby, The Long Winding Road, Yesterday, Anyway, so can you mention just a few, mention some of the George songs, a few songs. We already talked about a few. Did we talk about Sylvia Griffin?
We did. I don't know if we did, maybe before we started, but certainly Love's a State of Mind. Yeah. One of my favorite by Sylvia Griffin, an obscure single she released in England. Didn't have any real chart success. Her career wasn't terribly successful over there. She's a virtual unknown in the States, but she did this song called Love's a State of Mind, and George loved it and eventually ended up, as promised, playing on it. And he plays some of his best slide guitar work right at the beginning of the song and throughout. It's one of my favorites. Another one, which George claims is his personal favorite, best slide guitar work ever, is on Leave a Light On, Belinda Carlisle. George considered that his finest guitar solo work ever, including his own work. And that slide guitar solo, even though it comes late in the song, made that song a hit, in my opinion. It totally made the song. So, I mean, there are dozens of examples of brilliant George Harrison slide guitar solos out there that make anyone that even isn't terribly interested in the subject of this book should maybe think twice and go out and seek out some of these recordings, because they're amazing.
Now, Sylvia Griffin, if I remember correctly, wasn't she a friend who worked with Elton John, and Elton John asked George to do a favor?
Correct. Yeah, she was signed to Rocket Records, which was Elton's record label.
Yeah.
And it was through that association that she met George, and she played him some of her songs. And while Love's a State of Mind was not one of her favorite songs, George thought it was the best song that she had played for him. And eventually she got invited out to Friar Park, and he laid down the solo, and he made a tape of some of his favorite songs at the time for her, and gave her a cassette tape of his favorite songs, not of his, but of other artists. And she just said he was a lovely host, and she had a wonderful time working with him. And you hear that over and over and over and over. 99 out of 100 members of Ringo Starr's All-Starr Band pretty much tell the same story. How great of a boss he is to work for, how much fun it is being in the All-Starr Band, and just how funny Ringo is, and how he's a great storyteller, and treats his people well. And it's a very professional organization, and everyone is treated like royalty, and it's just great to work with, and the formula works, and the bands always seem to get along, and Ringo's the focal point. They all want to please him, so it works.
It tells you something when a musician who's put out a lot of great music, like the members of the All-Starr Bands have, and for years they could be in Ringo's band and keep playing the same 3 songs of theirs over and over and over again. It's really because, well, they love being in the band. There's great chemistry in the band. I just saw the most recent tour 3 times. Just saw it, the third show a few nights ago, and this band is so super tight. And for any of these great musicians to say, I'm only going to play 3 songs of mine, it must get awfully monotonous at times to keep playing those same songs, but they do it in part because they love Ringo so much, and they know what an honor it is to be in a band with him.
That's exactly what they'll tell you, over and over and over, almost to the last member of his band that's in this book of mine. They all pretty much say the same thing, and that's to serve Ringo. It's such an honor, because 9 out of 10 times they'll all tell you, if it wasn't for the Beatles, they wouldn't be the musicians they are today. They would have sought some other career. But seeing the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, or listening to their music, so inspired them that was the career path they chose. And so they want to give thanks and honor that gift that they received from one of those 4 Beatles.
Yeah. Look at Greg Bissonette.
Yeah.
He is such a joy to talk to. He's such
nice guy, super guy. That's because he's from Michigan.
I see.
I managed Greg. Ringo has not contributed to one of Greg's songs, but I interviewed Greg, and he was such a nice guy, and we were both Michigan guys. And he just kept going and talking, and I transcribed everything. And I said, one way or another, Greg, I'm going to fit you into this book. So after the foreword, I put in a little like preamble called "Drumming is My Madness," Greg Bissonette reminiscing on being an all-star band member. And he
Okay.
pretty much gives the whole history of how, he got brought into the All-Star Band because he didn't have the 3 hits, right? He's the only member of the band who's never had a solo spot, and he's never had a hit. But Ringo loved his drumming so much and felt so comfortable with him that he's been with Ringo longer than any other member of the All-Star Band, and yet he doesn't have a hit song to sing. So that tells you something about Greg's talent and about Ringo.
You do have Warren Ham. Warren Ham never had a recording career of his own.
Yeah, but he's more the Mark Rivera type in that he fills in all the different holes, whether it's percussion or saxophone or keyboards or whatever it might happen to be. He's that multi-instrumentalist utility player that can sing backing vocals and do whatever is needed. So I see him as more as the replacement for Mark Rivera.
Yeah, he's doing the job.
Oh yeah, he's good. He's talented for sure.
Those high notes on the Toto songs.
Yeah.
Luther doesn't sing. He does them. Yeah. By the way, I feel a little embarrassed to say this, but what's with the Bissonette? It's always
that's the French pronunciation.
Yeah, I didn't know if
I don't know if he goes with Bissonette or Bissonette.
I've always heard Bissonette. The only person I've ever heard it pronounced Bissonette is from Ringo.
Yeah,
I didn't know if Ringo was joking or what.
Probably because Ringo's English and he probably knows enough French that he's gone, well, the French pronunciation of that would be Bissonette.
Okay. All right.
So, but I've never actually asked Greg, how do you pronounce it? Is it Bissonette or Bissonette? And he'd probably look me in the eye and say, take your pick,
He might just make it Bissonette because Ringo calls him.
Yeah. Super, super sweet guy. He really is.
I know. His positive energy is so infectious. And it is one of the greatest moments you will ever see live. I know Ringo is not a part of this, but if you see Ringo and the All-Stars, zero in on Frankenstein and what the band does on that song. And there's a dual drum part between Greg Bissonette and Edgar Winter. And it's, what Greg does, you got to see it to believe it.
Well, he comes from quite a musical family. I don't know if you knew that, from the Detroit area. His father, his family had a band in Detroit area. They used to play at the Rooster Tail, a pretty well-known club in the Detroit area for many, many years. And Greg and I also have one other thing in common besides both being from southeastern Michigan, and that is that Greg and I both attended the Beatles 1966 show at Olympia Stadium in Detroit. We were both at that show.
Yeah, I heard him talk about that. What do you remember?
Flash bulbs. Remember those flash cubes? There used to be those little square flash cubes. Yeah. And when the Beatles came out, every girl in that audience of 15,000 people was shooting off their cameras, their little Instamatics with those flashbulb cubes. And when they were done with them, they threw them at the stage. And when the lights went up at the end of that show, there had to be 2 feet of debris surrounding the bottom of that stage, from hairbrushes, purses, shoes, lipstick cases, flashbulb cubes, compact girls' compact makeup kits, everything. That was what, and when the flashbulb cubes went off all at once when they first came out, it created a strobe effect, which was uncanny then, because I didn't know they didn't have strobe effect lighting back then, right, per se. And that wasn't anything, they just had spotlights on them. But all these flashbulb tubes going off at once created a strobe effect. And then the people in the audience threw everything at the stage. That was the most profound memory I have of that show. And I saw both shows. I saw the afternoon and the evening show. So
Could you hear them? Could you hear them?
yes, you could. I could. Believe it or not, the afternoon show was not a sellout.
I know
Olympia Stadium.
shows weren't sellouts.
Yeah. The evening one, I think, was pretty well sold out, but I had a much better seat. I was at the side of the stage, probably no more than maybe 75 feet from Paul, on the stage right.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, you could hear them. And the evening crowd was more of a older crowd because it was in the evening. So
Yeah.
there wasn't as much screaming. So, yeah, you could hear them. That wasn't too much of a problem. And I remember Paul stepping on a piece of lipstick and it caught on the bottom of his shoe. And so wherever Paul moved around on the stage, you could see this red streak of lipstick. But just
Maybe someday you'll tell him that story. They'll say,
I would love to, just all the crap that ended up. And literally there were 2 feet of debris around the front of that stage.
it's amazing. But what did you think of their performance? Or do I even need to ask?
It was more event than performance. It was more happening. I mean, it was such, they were on and they were off. 10 songs, 2.5 minutes each, 25 minutes. They were on, and you sat there. It was a hot summer day in August in Detroit in a building that wasn't, I don't believe, terribly air conditioned, with that crowd. But it was, you watched all the opening acts, each one would come out for a half hour. You had the Ronettes without Ronnie, and you had Bobby Hebb, and you had the Remains and the Circle. So you had already 2 hours of acts before the Beatles came out, and then they were on and off in less than a half hour. And with all the screaming and with the strobe effect of the flashbulb cubes and people throwing everything at the stage, it was eerie. It was an event more than it was just a musical experience. It was like, my God, there they are for real. And I remember thinking how much more red and brownish John's hair was, where the rest of their hair was black. John's hair was, when you actually saw him live or in person, and you can look at photos and you'll see this in some photos, his hair was fairly reddish.
Huh.
It certainly was auburn. It wasn't dark brown, and it certainly wasn't black. And I remember, and I remember the striped suits. They wore the striped suits at that show. And they finished with Long Tall Sally. That I remember, because some of the shows they finished with in '66 with I'm Down, and some they finished with Long Tall Sally. And some they wore those satin sort of greenish purple, I don't know what color they were, sort of a dark greenish weird color with the big wide lapels, and in some shows, and then in others they wore those gray pinstripe type suits.
Right.
They were in the gray suits.
Since you weren't too far from the stage, you didn't use binoculars, I guess, or anything like that, right?
No, I did not. Wished I had. But no.
Huh. And did they sound, I know you said it's more of an event, but did they sound tight as a band to you?
To me they did, but then when you go back and listen to some of those tapes of '66 shows, boy, they didn't sound all that great on some of those shows. I think they were pretty much by that point phoning it in, I really do. I think that's why they quit. I think they'd been touring for so many years. People couldn't hear them anyway. They were on stage, they were off stage, they were doing their hits that they'd done for years. How many years had they done rock and roll music? Which I think is what they opened with. And and a lot of their newer stuff, was more difficult to do live. So
I say that about Revolver, but sometimes if you could do Paperback Writer,
yeah,
you could do
Taxman.
Possibly Dr. Robert. I mean,
Yeah.
they're similar
Yeah.
in style. I know what they're saying about how complicated the music got. Certainly you couldn't do Tomorrow Never Knows. or
right. Or she said, yeah,
yeah, you couldn't do that. But the simpler production ones, I want to tell you,
sure,
I
yeah,
could see that happening,
yeah.
you know,
Got to Get You in My Life. I mean, Paul does that live now, so
but you would have needed brass of some kind,
yeah.
you know. But I'm sure it was one of the, do you look at it as one of the greatest moments of your
Oh
life?
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, it was, how many people can say they saw the Beatles twice?
Well,
So yeah,
I'm married to a woman who, and I don't really talk about this much, but I don't know many people who can say she saw the Beatles in concert and she saw each of the four of them individually. Because it's really hard to find people that have seen John and George at this point. There's so few concerts of John's, especially.
yeah. I saw John at the John Sinclair rally in Ann Arbor, so I did get to see John.
Okay. And you,
Came on at about 3 o'clock in the morning, did 4 songs, and was gone. And had to sit through like 8 hours of political speeches. Stevie Wonder was a highlight, and Bob Seger was a highlight. But yeah, that was at Chrysler Arena. That was so I did see, and I saw George at Olympia in '74 at Olympia Stadium. Ravi was not there, and that show almost got canceled because they'd had a horrible snowstorm, even though it was in November. It was
oh,
about 2 feet of snow had come down like 2 or 3 days earlier, and they still didn't have the streets cleaned out. So they almost canceled the Detroit show, and Ravi had gotten sick. Previously, I think the previous show was in Chicago, and so he didn't play. They did have the Indian set,
right.
but Ravi was not there at the Detroit show. And what I thought was cool, we had tickets behind the stage. It was the only tickets I could get. And George actually turned around and did play a couple of times during several songs, turned around and played to the people sitting behind the stage, which I thought was really cool.
It's great to acknowledge them. Did you think at that moment his voice was hoarse or bad?
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, his voice was shot. Yeah, badly.
Hmm.
Yeah. He was croaking from the first song to the last.
That's sad. I mean, I saw
Yeah.
the 74 show at the Nassau Coliseum in Long Island, and I could barely hear George sing. I
Yeah.
heard the band really well. The band
Yeah.
was,
Oh, it was a great show, and the band was tremendous. But yeah, pity his voice was gone.
hmm. I still hope that there's some kind of commercial release that'll come out from the Harrison family, because I'm sure you
So
can
do I.
good takes of certain songs where his
So
voice
do I.
is the best of
And
them.
even with his voice gone, it was still a great, great, great show and great music. And I love the Indian section.
Hmm. But yeah, and it's a part of history.
Absolutely.
How many concerts can you say George did in his lifetime? Only two.
Not many.
So yeah. Well, anyway, oh, I almost forgot to ask you, since you brought up the Belinda Carlisle recording, how did George get to record with her? How did that whole thing happen?
That came about through Rick Knowles, who was the producer, who had met George, and George at a party and had commented to him how he liked his production work. And he asked him what he was doing. And Rick said, well, I'm working with Belinda Carlisle. And then come to find out, Belinda's husband or future husband, which was James Mason's son, had known Harrison briefly through casual acquaintances. And so the word went out, and they sent the tapes to George, and he sent the tapes back with his finished bit and said, you owe me a beer. And that was that. And that's kind of typical, and that he did the same thing with Ruby Horse, which was another band,
Right.
that he played on, an unknown band. But he loved the song, and they had the same management company, and that's how that connect took place. There were each artist was managed by I think it was Jeff Kramer
Okay.
at the time.
Punch Drunk, the name of that song.
Yeah, which is another great Harrison guitar solo.
Yeah. So for anyone watching that hasn't heard these songs, we're gonna try to make it available. Check them out on YouTube if they're there, and if I can manage to get the links, I'll put it like I said, in the description box. So hold up the book one more time, Kris,
The book,
the new one.
and it is available at most retail outlets, book retail outlets, and Amazon. And you can also get a copy from me if you want to email me. And this is an easy email to remember. It's 6270@charter.net. Just remember the Beatles recorded for EMI together as a group between 62 and 70. And that was also the name of two of their greatest hits albums. So just the numbers 6270@charter.net. And I'll tell you how to get a hold of a signed copy of the book.
Okay. And you told me that the new cover, the reason why
Yes,
it's designed this way, explain it.
it's a composite of the previous two editions. The first edition had the film stripes.
I have-
Yes. And then the second edition had the paintings. And so we combined the two to kind of remind the readers who are already familiar with these books that this is the third edition. And then on the back, we did the back in white and blue. And the idea of blue is everything's uncovered. The skies, all the darkness is gone because this back cover was dark. And the paper was pulled away and all of these things were still mysterious and undercover. So we wanted to convey the idea that the blue sky and the light has shined in and everything is open and is fully uncovered or fully revealed. So that was just kind of the idea, the concept of the new cover.
Do you plan on updating this book, as you know there's still going to be new side projects?
It seems for whatever reason to be every 12 years, and in 12 years I will be, God willing, 83 years of age, and the Beatles will be in there. The two surviving Beatles, God willing, they are still alive, will be in their 90s. So how much new material they will contribute to, I'm sure in the next few years there will be a good handful from each. But beyond that, whether there's enough there to warrant a fourth edition, or whether all of us will be around then, hopefully, only the good Lord knows. So
Let's hope there's plenty more. I mean,
it's been a fun ride.
We've all been spoiled here, super spoiled when it comes to the Beatles. So
we have.
Yeah. Well, thank you for all this tremendous work you've done through the years. And like I said, the new book is called Fully Uncovered. And it's been a joy, Kris, and love to have you back talking about some other side projects.
Anytime, Ken. Been great. Really appreciate it. Great questions. Thank you so much.
Hey, I'm learning from you because
Alrighty.
so much stuff. I was just saying before we recorded this that this is like the Holy Grail. It's almost impossible to find every single side project that any of the Beatles, and you still learn about new stuff all the time that happened a long time ago.
Yeah, you get a different angle on a story, you know. So you talk to a producer or whoever, and all of a sudden you find out, well, I didn't know that part of the story, you know.
There's always new stuff to learn. There will
That's
never
for
be a
sure.
time when we know everything about the Beatles. That's just a reality. Kris, thanks again. Thanks to everyone watching. And we'll see you soon. Take care.
All righty. Hope folks will check out the book.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Take care.